So current account deficits. If you're going to understand this, you need to understand about the balance of payments as a whole. So if you haven't watched the one on the structure of the balance of payments, I suggest that you go back and do so, because you need to understand the idea that the current account plus the financial capital account, that they add up to zero in order to understand this. So current account deficit, essentially what it means is that the amount of money that's going out on imports, that we spend on foreign goods and services, or we pay out on incomes, on assets owned in the UK, is more than the amount of money that we earn from abroad. So kind of from this part of the balance of payments, the supply of pounds is greater than the balance of pounds. Now, as we said, overall, this will sum up to zero, but we're saying therefore, that fundamentally, we are buying more than we sell. And we're paying more to foreign businesses than we are earning from them. So does that matter? So on the one hand, we can say, well, there are negatives about that. It's obviously the case, that there is an obvious negative, which is that if imports are greater than exports, we know that aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. If imports are greater than exports, then what that means is that aggregate demand is lower than it might otherwise have been. So this is kind of, some people describe it as a drag on growth, because we're spending money abroad. We're spending money on German goods, on Chinese goods, on American goods, rather than spending it on local consumers, and therefore actual growth is going to be lower than it could have been. Maybe that implies that we're not generating employment and jobs and so on and so forth. And that's kind of a relatively straightforward and easy point that you could make. You could draw an ADAS diagram if it made you happy. But we also said a minute ago that from this part of the current account, it means that kind of the supply of pounds, from the current account, is greater than demand for pounds in the current account. And we said overall that's going to be financed by a financial account surplus. But suppose that financial account surplus suddenly drops away. Suppose suddenly, suppose there was a sudden stop, a sudden loss of confidence in the UK. Then all of a sudden, all of those inflows, all that money coming into UK property and UK shares and UK banks, that's going to dry up. And if that happens, then all of a sudden, what's going to happen is there's going to be a big decrease in exchange rate. And that happened back in 2016 when there was the vote over Brexit. Nobody had expected that. And all of a sudden, investors kind of went, well, shit, I don't want to keep my money in the UK. I don't want to keep on putting money into this economy. And the exchange rate dropped by kind of about 10% overnight. So why does that matter? So what we're saying is that, so firstly there's a reduction in aggregate demand, and secondly what we're saying is there is the risk, therefore, of a big decrease in the exchange rate. And the main problem with a big decrease in the exchange rate, in the long term, it's not necessarily so bad because it makes your exports cheaper, it makes you more competitive. But the short run impact, it leads to a big increase in the price of imports. That can lead both to cost-push inflation, but more obviously, it reduces living standards. It increases costs for firms that import raw materials. Everything in shops is going to go up, and if you're dependent on imports, then that's a big worry, because the price of everything that you're buying from abroad is going to go up. So those two kind of starting points that I'd be inclined to make. Plus the idea that a third point that you might want to make is kind of, well, you might say that it's indicative of an underlying problem. It might be. So what you might be saying is, why does the UK have a large current account deficit? Well, maybe it's just that our productivity is so much lower than that of Germany and France and the US. Maybe we just can't compete on world markets because our costs are too high. So it could be indicative of supply side weakness. It might be showing you that actually you're just a bit crap, and that therefore you need to do something about it. And also, there is a sense in which you're also potentially quite import dependent. A lot of your goods and services, a lot of what you eat, use as raw materials and so on, is coming from abroad, and that makes you vulnerable. That makes you vulnerable to changes in the exchange rate and changes to kind of global geopolitics. On the other hand, it's not necessarily that bad. If you look at the UK, we've had a current account deficit pretty much for the whole of my life, and that's a long time. And yeah, we don't appear to have exploded in a puff of smoke or anything. And there are certain benefits about it. Yeah, one is you can say, well, effectively, what's happening here is that we're out-consuming our production possibility frontier. Yeah, what's happening is, and therefore our short-run living standards, our short-run standard living is higher than it might otherwise have been, because essentially we're getting stuff for nothing. Yeah, what's happening is, imagine your economy is on its PPF at point A, and we use a certain amount of resources. Yeah, so this is goods and this is services. We use a certain amount of resources to make goods for export. So we take our factory production and we sell those goods abroad. We send them to China, to Germany, to France, to the US. Once those goods have gone, we don't have them anymore. Yeah? Our short-term living standards are lower because we've used those resources to make things for other countries. But for a country with a current account surplus, so deficit, sorry, for a country with a current account deficit, what that means is that actually it's importing far more from other countries than it's sending to them. So we can consume at a higher level than we can produce, which means that our short-run living standards are higher than they might otherwise have been. So one, we can out-consume our production possibility frontier, and two, obviously, we said it decreases aggregate demand, but that's not always, reducing aggregate demand isn't always a bad thing. We can argue that that's anti-inflationary. So it's kind of soaking up excess demand. So at certain stages of the economic cycle, you might say, well, it's not necessarily that bad. But really, I think the most interesting point about the current account deficit is kind of, just ultimately whether we should care or not. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on what it is. Yes. So what are these imports? Yes. So suppose that you're a low-income country. And what you're doing is you're importing, capital and technology. Well, you might say, well, that's fine because it's giving us the resources, it's giving us the infrastructure and kind of equipment that we're going to need to be able to industrialize and grow in the longer term. So you might say, well, that doesn't matter so much. You might say it depends on its size, obviously. But also you might say it depends on its kind of its structure, its nature. So obviously, suppose that's time and that's a current account surplus deficit. You would presumably say, okay, here is country A. Country A probably isn't that bothered. It has a cyclical deficit. What's tending to happen is that when that economy is growing fast and consuming lots, it has a deficit. Because it has high levels of consumer spending. In recessions, it has a surplus, because people are spending less. So overall, it balances, so it has nothing to worry about at all, to be completely frank. Whereas, country B, coming to a classroom near you, that would be the UK. Regardless of the state of the economic cycle, it has a current account deficit. It has a structural deficit. And therefore, they would be more worried if there is something to worry about. But I think if you're going to be smart about this, if you talk about the current account deficit, you really need to talk about its evil twin. And we said that the balance of payments as a whole sums to zero. We said that if there is a current account deficit, by definition, that means there is a financial account or financial and capital account surplus. Financial account surplus. Therefore, the nature of that surplus is going to be quite important. In other words, what's happening is that we're spending money, we're selling sterling, to buy goods and services from abroad. Those overseas buyers of sterling, we're selling sterling to get their foreign currency. They're keeping that sterling and they're using it to put into the UK economy. And the key question is, what are they doing with it? Is it hot money? That's not particularly helpful because all it's really doing is supporting the exchange rate, but it's not really doing anything particularly useful one way or the other. It might be bonds. Well, it's quite useful, because what it does is it makes it easier for the government to borrow. If there's a lot of demand for UK government bonds, that keeps their price high, makes them easy to sell. it reduces bond yields and so on. But the obvious drawback, is there's kind of an outflow on the current account, of interest on those bonds, and therefore that further worsens the current account in the long term. So that's a potential concern. Same argument for shares. It makes it easier for firms to borrow, but the dividends are paid abroad, and it means you've got foreign ownership of UK businesses. Property, again, the risk there obviously is you're getting a bubble. It's a lot of the reason that London house prices are so high is foreign ownership of property there. And again, the kind of rents on those properties, they're all going abroad. So again, that's kind of worsening your current account. But probably the most interesting one, and something the UK has generally been quite successful with, is FDI. So if what's happening is that overseas buyers of sterling, we sell our pounds, what they're doing is they're using it to come and set up businesses in the UK. They're setting up factories, headquarters, retail outlets, and so on. And imagine those things are then producing goods and services which are in turn exported. Then at this stage you have a really good story, which is we buy iPhones from abroad, the money is used to set up factories in the UK that then create jobs, growth, and further exports. So in the end, a lot depends. This is quite a complex essay, complex area, if you were to write something on it. Start off with the simple points, but I would try and get something in on the financial account, because that shows an understanding of the balance of payments as a whole.